welcome back.
Yes, I'm so excited to be back, and this is a topic, the one we're about to jump into, that's hot and fiery. It really gets my blood going. So,
it's also something that affects a lot of couples.
Yes. So what's the topic for today?
Well, it's the idea that men want sex more than women do.
Grrr.
How do you feel about that personally?
I don't agree with it at all. It's not been my experience. I've always wanted sex more than my partners.
Okay.
Yes. So,
well, tell us some stories about that, because I don't know if people really believe that could
I think the
be
sexy
true.
stories are going to be in the explicit
later
part
part?
of the podcast. But
Well, you wanting it more than them might not be the sexiest story, but...
yeah, exactly. But so we're going to cover here some things to do with desire, arousal. We get a lot of complaints on either side. Men really just wanting sometimes their woman to desire them with lust and passion, and women just feeling kind of frumpy and kind of overlooked at times by their partner. Or he's
always pushing himself onto me, or that he only comes on in a very specific way, and so he's only engaging her with like a physical genital touch.
Yes, or only when he wants it, and there's no care for the erotic space before or after.
So it almost would sound like it is the case that men want it more than women.
In that respect.
In those scenarios.
Yes. For me, I'll just share a quick story. So this was a long-term relationship. Sex was great in the beginning, and then something happened in my partner's life that caused great depression. And of course, with depression, there is a suppression of libido. So we need to discuss the things that actually impact arousal and desire, because there's some very real things that do cut us off of our desire. So what was happening was I literally was at the mercy of whenever he would suddenly want sex, which was very rare, maybe once a month or something, I would then just have to say yes, because it was the only time I was going to get it. And it wasn't ideal, though it wasn't the greatest conditions. So it would appear that he was the one leading and wanting sex more than me, but it wasn't true. I wanted it every day, but if I even remotely directed sexual energy at him, he would shut down. He said, no, this has to come from a man. So he had very strong beliefs that men initiate sex. I'm like, well, then initiate it. You know, like, what are you doing? Like, I want it every day, and you're not initiating it. So it was a huge problem in the relationship.
Well, and that also reflects too, like with a lot of clients that I've heard, you know, where it's actually the woman that's wanting more sex. Typically it has to do with maybe the guy is working late hours, he's stressed out from work, he's not sleeping enough, maybe not eating correctly, not exercising, and meanwhile the wife is maybe more staying at home, and so she has the time to work out, she has the time to like really tend to and care for herself, isn't as stressed out about all of the external things.
That's if there's no kids.
And then I was just about to say, and then of course this can all be flipped all of a sudden now if there are kids and there's all these internal things that are going on at the home that doesn't really allow her to take the time to nurture kind of her own relationship. And I think that's whether, you know, we're talking about, I think one of the popular terms is like mismatched libido, where one person wants it, one person doesn't, or that our desire systems work differently. One is this idea that there's spontaneous desire, meaning that, like you were saying, your partner would just get turned on out of nowhere and then want something, whereas like responsive desire is a lot more where a person is like touching you, and then because of the touch, because of being stimulated, you then respond. And
so desire is different than arousal. Maybe we can also talk about that, because the thing is that men want sex more than women, then that's a desire thing more than an arousal thing.
Well, and how do we, so let's define it. Like, so at least when I use the word arousal, and you can tell how you're using it, I'm talking on a physical, anatomical level, that you have blood flow, engorgement, more oxygen firing to the nerves and the erogenous zones, and so then you feel stimulated.
Yeah, so that would be, you know, what we term physical arousal, which can also happen when you're not sexually desiring something. Like you could be physically aroused just because you're working out. Like a lot of women will report even having orgasms sometimes doing certain activities in the gym, and they weren't thinking about sex, but the body is being moved in a very specific way.
Or you have to go to the bathroom in the morning. The guy, you have morning wood, you have to
exactly.
pee. Also, you have this massive erection, which can feel really great, but it's not so much associated to
And then depending on the age group, I mean, I had plenty of young men come to me and say, I don't know how to control my erection. It's really distressing me because it's just happening everywhere all the time.
And I don't even want sex.
And I don't want sex. It's just happening. And it's embarrassing, and it's causing the women around me to get like upset, and I don't want to upset them. And so these things can be very different. So that's the physical arousal. There's affective arousal, which is an emotional level of arousal. And what we mean by arousal is you're activated. So maybe you have an activity and you're just feeling like so much joy, you're overwhelmed, but it also could be anger or it could be fear. So it's anything that triggers the system to turn on, meaning you're awake, you're alert, and you're paying attention. So that's the affective arousal or the emotional arousal. And then
I've noticed also too with the emotional arousal too, like sometimes it's a person needs to feel that personal connection to the person, a sense of affinity, of oneness. Now, of course, all these things can go the opposite way too, because being too close emotionally also can stop a person from being into them sexually. For instance, like you'll see a lot of times, oh, this is my friend, you know, like I can't, like we've been friends forever. I love this person to death. We're so close, but I wouldn't want to ruin that. And so it's not sexual in that way.
Yes, exactly.
Or maybe you're an avoidant type where you're like, I love to go to the club, pick up somebody, have sex, but the second it starts to like actually become more personal and feeling this feeling of oneness as opposed to turn on, it actually creates.
I think that's really funny because I wouldn't have categorized myself as avoidant when I was younger, but I did not want emotional connection with the guy that I was going to take home. I just wanted to have some hot sex and then see you later. Maybe because I was kind of raised as more my dad's son, and so maybe I had more tendencies towards what we call like male typical behavior or whatever. But I was just, sometimes I just wanted to pick up a guy, have a nice time, and not have this emotional connection. But to me, that wouldn't be, I wouldn't have categorized myself as avoidant, which is interesting. But I was in a period of time where I was like, no, I just want to have sex. I don't want to have a relationship.
And maybe you were avoidant of not wanting that deep emotional intimacy there, but at least when I've heard you speak about it, it seemed like you just were more avoidant of the drama that always seemed to come with.
Yeah, that was annoying with the drama. I'm like, oh my god, I don't want this at all. And then there's cognitive arousal, and Barbara Marx Hubbard, for example, labeled that vocational arousal, which I find it very sexy. So think of cognitive arousal when someone's talking about such an evocative topic, an idea. And
it's like kind of like a sapiosexual. It's like
yeah,
you get turned on by their mind and their thoughts, and
you're just getting this whole new world cracking open before your eyes, and you're like, what? Wait, what is this? And you just get super turned on from a cognitive, from thinking, from exploring new ideas.
Now with the sapio, that has a lot to do with kind of like that they're smart, they're highly intellectual. Now I guess you could also have cognitive arousal though, from just being mentally turned on by someone, or is it you distinguish those? I mean, I guess it's kind of arbitrary.
It's arbitrary, really, at this point. But then you were also mentioning before we started recording the anxious types who really need that deep, like affective arousal, which is that romantic or very deep oneness.
A lot of security that they won't leave you, these type of things.
And then you've also talked in your paper, you wrote a paper on this, and there's also people who are more, what's it called, stable?
Secure attachment.
There you go. So secure attached types. And in the secure attached, you actually have a range. You're not this like kind of neutral zone where nothing's happening.
Yes.
You actually like, so can you talk a little bit about that? And then we're going to go back to whether like men actually want sex more than women.
Well, I mean, you have the three main types of attachment. You'll hear some like anxious ambivalent, where it's kind of a further down the spectrum of someone who's neither avoidant nor anxious, but is demonstrating kind of both of those. But this typically started with looking at how children behaved with parents when they would leave the room. It was called the strange situation, and it was a Bowlesby and Ainsworth study. And they noticed that kids typically would either become a secure kid would cry a little bit, parent leaves, come back, they'd want to go and hug the parent, get some security. Once they feel safe, then they go off and play.
I think that was me.
Okay, so I mean that's
they're leaving, bye, like and then as soon as they're gone, like yeah, party time. But then when they came back, I'm like whoop whoop, and like happy they're back too. So.
Well, so that's the part that's important to recognize about secure attachment, as opposed to like that you don't demonstrate any avoidant or any anxious behaviors. It's just that it is quote unquote appropriate to the environment.
Yes.
So it's natural that when the parent's leaving, you feel a little bit anxious. Where are they going? You don't want them
or
to
you
go.
miss them,
or maybe if you're a little bit upset, you feel a little avoidant and turn away from them. Then they come back, and then maybe you're a little bit avoidant still, and then you're very happy to see them, and you need to be cuddled, and then you go off and do your thing.
Yeah.
So the main thing is that you can always go off and explore, but you feel that you have a good safety that you can always come back to. Now, when they notice that kids, however, were not getting that attention for different reasons, a lot of times with how the parent would be treating them, then they would start to become anxious, which would mean that they would become very clingy to the parent. Even when the parent left, they were still very emotionally distraught. Parent would come back, and they would do this kind of push-pull thing where they'd want the parent's attention, but then when they get it, they couldn't have it, they couldn't trust it, and so there's a lot of this back and forth. Now, the same thing then, if that goes further, eventually notice the kids would start to actually become avoidant, meaning that when the parent would leave, they would ignore them. When the parent was there, they would ignore them. When the parent returned, they would ignore them, just so as not to engage themselves emotionally because it was painful. And so instead they just start to disconnect and actually avoid that kind of connection. How this then translates as you look kind of as it developed into adult romantic attachment with Hazan and Shaver, they were looking at now how do these type of behaviors play out in adult romantic attachment. So basically when you start dating, when you start marrying, when you start having sex. And they were noticing that there were some consistencies between people that had avoidant as child and avoidant as an adult. And so they would talk about conditioned attachment, meaning that if you're one way from the beginning, then you're always kind of that way. And I disagree with that because I think it can be highly situational. I think that you can,
Absolutely. I mean, there were some relationships that I would be in. I was intensely anxious, like all the time, to the point where like my inner body would shake. And I was like, what's going on? When are they coming back? And then they come back, and I'd be just like almost drowning them in attention and just doing all this weird behavior.
Yeah.
There are other times where I'm like, I don't care. Like, I just don't care. Like, I just felt apathetic almost in the connection. And there's times where I've been like both. I'm just like, okay, like I'm gonna miss you, but have fun. And then when they come back, I'm happy. But when they're not there, I'm not like obsessively thinking about them, and I'm also not like rejecting them.
Well, this is one of the things I think that gets left out is that when you have a secure attached person, as opposed to kind of being a homeostasis, you have a robust nervous system, a range within which you can interact emotionally, relationally, etc. So that would mean then that you could do some of these more avoidant type of behaviors, which you kind of see more at a club when you're picking someone up and there's a lot of more power play and you're not being super emotionally engaged at the time, but you're just playing that game of ludus, which is like kind of lustful play. And that can be very important in a long-term relationship to actually keep that. And so someone who's secure can do that, whereas a person who's anxious would feel very put off by that, and a person who's avoidant would need to have that. Yeah. Now, then a person who's secure also has the ability to do the romantic stuff, bring out the flowers, do a lot of the eye gazing, stay emotionally close, which would be necessary for someone that's anxious and actually be a huge turnoff for somebody that is avoidant. And so the important thing to notice here, though, is how can we develop a robust arousal system, so that way then we can choose it to engage with others, do it with ourselves, have different flavors to it. And this is very important in a long-term relationship because it adds a dynamism to it.
And this episode is not about that. It's about whether guys want sex more than women, but we wanted to talk about this because I don't agree with that statement, and I do agree that men want sex more than women. I think that the kind of sex that a lot of women are getting is not the kind of sex that you want. So,
which is the very reason why we think, oh, well, women have a lower libido, men want sex more, but any person that's having a negative experience over and over and over again are going to want it less and less and less.
Exactly. So actually some of the more recent studies are debating whether there is such a thing as low libido if there's not like a drug-induced reason, for example, like pharmaceuticals or surgical reason.
Or hormonal reasons.
Yeah. it's interesting with hormonal reasons, because here's the thing that's messing everyone up. When they study women that are going through menopause, they make a lot of assumptions. Oh, they want sex less because there's less testosterone. Every theory they have around women and sex and desire goes out the window the second that woman meets a hot new person. The second she could be not wanting sex, completely turned off, feeling dry, and like all the symptoms they talk about, she meets someone that turns her on, she's suddenly wet, she wants it all the time, like she's really, so I really feel that there's a beautiful thing to honor in the human psyche, the psychosexual part of us, that there is a deep relationship with, am I connected with my environment? Is my environment evoking a yes feeling in my body or a no feeling in my body? Plus, all the beliefs that we hold around sex actually form us. So recently I had the pleasure to speak with a completely different culture. And I asked the group, what is going on culturally around sex? What are the sexual beliefs? It was amazing what was coming out. I mean, it was clearly a culture that's much more misogynistic than I'm used to, but it was that culture. So we then had to confront, well, this is the waters we're swimming in. We're not even noticing that this is just something we naturally accept. So perhaps the statement that men want sex more than women could come from a culture where women are not supported to explore their desire. Because in the culture that I'm referring to just now, if a woman explores her desire, she's labeled as someone that's out of control, and that culture respects people who are in control. So there's a much greater play at hand. What I'm wanting to do with this conversation, though, is to keep it kind of sexy and useful. So what could we talk about for the next few minutes before we get into more explicit stuff that could really help the listener just understand that there is a dynamism when it comes to desire and arousal, and that we should actually stop saying men are this and women are that, because honestly, I think at some point in my research, I started realizing I need to use the word people, because if I put all the men into one box, it's disservice to them. And if I put all the women in one box, it's disservice to them, because there's really are some women who have a sex drive that's off the charts. And there really are men who have almost no sex drive.
Completely.
So,
well, that's the thing I think about hormonal. I think it's funny that the word hormonal, people automatically jump to, oh, it's an age thing that, we're talking andropause or menopause. But actually, when I say hormonal, I'm thinking, are you sleeping right? Are you eating right? Are you exercising?
Yeah.
Like, if these things are
Are
off,
you winning in life?
Yes.
Do you feel like you're losing?
You feel depressed. Exactly. These are the type of things then that will affect us. And I think what is important for this discussion and what we really want to go into is, one, how can you self-generate and maintain a high level of arousal inside your own body?
Yes.
Two, how can you share that with somebody? And three, how can you incite it?
Exactly. I think that's
in the other person.
That's where the discussion needs to go, because this is what's in our power now. Because when we make assumptions about the other or about ourselves, and we start to label, this is how it is, there's no more room to grow and have creativity. But if I suddenly go, wait, how can I cultivate more arousal desire in myself? What would just starting there, like, what would be needed so that I can walk around way more turned on in life?
Yes.
Huge question. Most times when I ask this question of women, they don't know.
Well, and this is a big part here, because a lot of guys are like, well, okay, I'll get myself super turned on, but then my partner's not going to sit there and want it. And then I'm just going to end up wanting it more from them, and they need to fulfill that for me. And then there's just going to be a lot of frustration. Woman also is thinking, oh, well, God, like, my partner's getting even more turned on now. He's just going to want it more, and I don't know what to do. Well, but I think the key about what it is here that we're talking about is becoming sovereign over your own arousal means that you can self-generate it, and therefore you're not having this constant pressure on your partner to having to fulfill it. Because I think this is a huge thing that really kills a lot of desire inside of, I think, typically what the standard is with the man wanting and the woman not, but it doesn't have to be that way. If there's one partner, though, that's always turned on and then has the sexpectation that the other person is going to have to fulfill it, then that other person is normally going to be feeling more and more turned off, versus I'm feeling really great in my body, I'm super turned on, I'm not putting pressure on you. In that case, then my turn on can actually be an invitation.
Exactly. And I was just thinking back to my situation, how it could have appeared again that the man was leading the desire piece, and I was, submissive and just kind of being, what are the two ones? There's, people label them spontaneous
and responsive.
Responsive, which
arousal. Or you can say receptive.
Let's just say we have an incredible range of desire, and we do not have to resort to labels.
Well, the idea of spontaneous is basically that you just get turned on in your mind because you're already turned on, and it just
randomly happens out of the blue,
whether I touch you or not, and then you want to have sex,
or if you're even there or not.
And they're normally saying that this is how men are, that they just randomly get turned on and then want to have sex. Whereas the majority of women, they're saying, are receptive or responsive desire, which means that you would only get turned on by the time that, like, if I were to start touching you or engaging with you sexually, which is confusing because then sometimes also that same research will say, oh no, but women, they need to be mentally turned on before they can be physically touched and put into it.
Look, desire is incredibly complex. I want to move into the explicit piece in a moment here. Desire is incredibly complex. My answer to the statement, men want sex more than women, is it depends.
Yeah.
Okay, it's situational. I don't agree. I think it's also cultural. In cultures where women get more points for being agreeable, get more points for being docile, they're not going to come forward with sexual aggression. I was brought up as a French Canadian. Being sexual is just part of life. So I was considered very sexually aggressive by a lot of men in the English-speaking part of Canada. They're like, whoa, like, what's going on with you? I'm like, oh, I just want to have sex. You don't want to have sex? Like,
or I've lived in Denmark, and a lot of people get very confused there because a lot of times it's the woman that is taking that initial step, and so all of a sudden you have a very hot foreign woman comes there and she's like, why aren't the guys picking me up? And it's like, no, you have to actually take the step and choose who you want. Like, oh, okay. And the second they do that, there's a lot of hookups.
Yes.
Or for a guy actually waiting for the woman to initiate in the sexual realm also can be a bit of a reverse there. And this is something that's more normal, though, in like the Scandinavian cultures.
So before we switch, I just want to finish this part with the speed dating research. So the first version of speed dating research, they had the women stationary, and every minute the men would rotate.
Oh, yes, this is a great study.
So what they concluded then was that the women were more passive, sexually receptive, and the men were more active, right? But one of the smart scientists said, wait a second, what would happen if we role reverse? We'll have the men be stationary and the women be the ones who are moving. Now, if their original theory was correct, it wouldn't matter that the women move around.
They would still be the passive ones.
Exactly. But what happened was, because it was the women moving, they actually suddenly were allowed to express their going for what they want.
Yes.
And the men, being forced to be still, naturally had to become more receptive and just accept whatever was coming toward them.
And maybe even a bit more selective too.
Exactly. So I love that because it just points to, again, we should use the word people. Some people want sex more than other people. That's true. And some people who want sex more than other people can go through a phase of life where that's less. So I think we just need to be more refined and say responsive in how we view desire in people.
So I think some of the factors we'll get into then is, what does actual physical arousal look like?
Yes.
Because there is something to do with the body mechanics there. What does mental arousal look like? What are the components of it? So it's not just this mystery that then you spontaneously mentally get turned on. But then also too, on the emotional level, what is necessary then for emotional turn on?
Yes.
And then when we can kind of see the bigger map of this, we can start to figure out, oh, well, these are the different things that have a tendency to work for my partner. How can I get them to stay in a high state of arousal? And so that way then it's not like sex is an on-off thing, but it's more like, no, we're in a sexual relationship. And then there's a certain rhythm by when things can get turned on or not, but we're actually in cadence with one another and much more attuned. So that way the other person's arousal turns me on as opposed to nullifying it.
Exactly. So shall we jump in?
All right, let's do it.
To join us for the complete and explicit version of this podcast, just simply upgrade your membership and you'll get instant access.